You remarked in your introduction that the film is about an England within an England. And now that we've seen the film, maybe you could expand a little bit about what of that England you wanted to explore with this film.
Well, I mean, I first got the idea for the film when I was cast in my previous film, which was Better Things, and normally I always work with non-actors. And when you're looking for non-actors, you need to go into the certain communities to kind of find the people that you want to collaborate with. And I found that when I was casting Better Things, I needed to go further and further afield, so I found myself in kind of small cities and kind of the larger towns. So I was in a lot of the estates that were kind of old sort of working class estates, the same sort of places that like me and my friends kind of grew up in. And it felt to me like these were very different environments from what I remembered kind of growing up. They were just very, very different. The kids had very, very different kind of lives. And the kids that I met there were very, very interesting. They were very, very generous kind of with their time, but they all had kind of similar stories. There was always this idea of kind of absent kind of parents or absent kind of fathers, and really no kind of continuity from their education, from their schooling into work, and no real clear idea of kind of careers or how they could have a job which extended beyond kind of 6 months or anything. And so I just got really curious about why that was the case, and I started to do a lot of research about these estates and why they were kind of built. And a lot of them were kind of built in order to service like the big kind of manufacturing sort of industry that we had. And when that disappeared, nothing really kind of replaced it. So a lot of these estates they basically didn't have any employment to kind of sustain them. So they lost a lot of the elements of kind of the community. You know, the grandparents' generation they'd finish school on the Friday when they left kind of school, and they'd start work on the Monday at one of the plants, and they literally kind of had a job for life. And of course, you had kind of the old idea of like the working men's clubs where they would all kind of drink, and they would all be kind of godparents to each other's children. There was real kind of continuity. They would kind of be best men at each other's weddings, everything like that. And when I researched the grandparents' generation, I actually spoke to them, a lot of people who worked in manufacturing. They would kind of all speak very, very highly of kind of the companies and so on that they kind of worked for. So there was a real kind of continuity, and everything kind of interlinked in a very kind of good and fair kind of way. And once that was removed, there was just a void. And so really what happened is very organically kind of something kind of filled that sort of void. And I think, you know, we all know the clichés about kind of broken Britain and kind of hoodies and all this sort of thing. But really that's just, it's intellectual and it's kind of academic, and we read it all the time in the articles. So I wanted to see if I could set a very emotional kind of story and a compelling story which was in that kind of environment, in that milieu. And at the same time kind of look at how organically that had grown and what was there now and what a possible kind of future was.
And I suppose we can see that through the character of Tim. I mean, he's very much someone, you spoke about the idea of family was very important to this film, and he's someone who's trying to kind of establish kind of new forms of family, I guess, after his father's kind of left and his mother's died, and, you know.
Yeah, I mean, basically he's having to deal with the fact that that old idea of family doesn't really exist anymore, that they don't have the glue to kind of hold themselves together, so they have to find a new set of kind of survival mechanisms, ones which aren't really kind of helped in any other way. There's nothing to kind of hold them together.
You mentioned in your previous film, Better Things, you worked largely with non-professionals, but here you're working with professional actors who just give kind of storming performances. So
yeah, thank you.
Can you explain a little bit how you came to cast the film? Because, you know, the cast is just incredible. So.
Well, I knew after Better Things that I wanted to try something different. I knew that I wanted to kind of work with actors, and I've always loved the films of kind of Alan Clark, and him working with kind of Gary Oldman and Tim Roth and kind of Ray Winstone. And so I always knew that there was like a pretty extremely good talent pool in kind of the UK. And I wanted to see if it was possible to find a group of performers who I found had the same type of raw sort of charisma level and the raw kind of talent level as what I associated with what I saw in kind of Alan Clark. So really it was about looking for kind of new faces, people that I hadn't really seen before, people who had done other work, but people who I didn't really necessarily know. And because I'd worked with non-actors, that was always about finding people who had a similarity to the character. But here it was kind of something kind of similar. I still had to feel that there was elements of their kind of personalities that were similar. I mean, with George, for instance, when I met him, we met kind of 4 or 5 times before we decided to work together, and I felt there was crossovers between him and Tim in that both characters are very sensitive. Both characters have also a very kind of courageous element to them. I think both characters have the idea that they can take on responsibility. I think both characters already have quite a large kind of moral compass, which is very, very set. And also when I met George, he seemed a lot kind of older than his years. And I just had this idea, and I spoke to George about it after I kind of cast him, is that I felt, you know, because there's these kind of similarities, I think if we strip away certain elements of George, we'll kind of discover Tim. So we decided, you know, how can we kind of do that? How can we kind of do it to start with kind of physically? And we decided to do that by losing a lot of weight. So that when he looked at himself in the mirror, he still kind of saw himself, but it was a different kind of himself that he saw. He began to relate to his body differently.
You're working with actors here, having worked with non-actors, and also there's a change from Better Things in the sense that you're kind of this film is in some ways a thriller, and you know you've got a car chase that's kind of really tense, and you know the opening scene when the police are chasing Greg is kind of really kinetically staged. So, just can you talk a little bit about the challenge? You know, how you wanted to challenge yourself in that front.
I just wanted to try a very, very different aesthetic and a very, very different kind of grammar. I think there's still kind of a signature that runs through it. But I just wanted to work in a different way. I mean, I've always loved that type of cinema. I've always loved the ability of cinema to kind of raise the heartbeat, for you to kind of really feel something. And I wanted to try that here. I wanted to see if it was possible to take some of the elements that you kind of, ingredients that you associate with kind of social realism and put them into kind of another kind of sphere, to put them into another kind of register, to marry it with something else. Because I think Better Things was not straightforward, but I think, you know, it has one type of aesthetic. And I wanted to see if you could marry these different things. I wanted to see if you could make kind of a socially conscious kind of thriller in that way. Yeah, this is the first time I've worked with David. The last film that I did was with a different DOP, one that I've worked with before and done short films before. But that was shot on film, and I knew that I wanted to shoot on digital this time. And so I wanted to work with a DOP who kind of was part of a generation that really was coming up with digital rather than kind of working with film first of all. But I worked very, very closely with David, and we kind of designed the aesthetic of the film literally over a year, kind of talking about which cameras and which lenses we were going to use and doing a lot of extensive kind of tests. And then also kind of figuring out actually a visual kind of language for it in terms of the compositions. Because we very rarely shoot on the line, we're quite often above or kind of below. And it's trying to do something different again, trying to find compositions and ways of covering scenes which I don't feel I've seen too much before. I think I always like to work in sequences rather than working in scenes. So I like the idea that kind of the film just kind of flows from kind of scene to scene. And I always like to play around with different kind of time frames. So we think we're in one space and then we'll move into a different space and then come back there and then go forward again. I always think with quite a bit of cinema that I see is kind of really about a storytelling which is to do with almost just filming a kind of theatrical kind of idea. And everything is just put on kind of the performances and everything is just put on the story. But I think, film is made up of so many components, but a lot of the components are taken from other things. So you have script writing, which is literature, or you have, cinematography, which is photography. But one thing which is completely unique to film is editing. And I think there's so much more that you can kind of do with it. There's so much more that you can get under the skin of the story or the character or get into the interior of kind of the people, because I think that's another thing which is very different with this film from kind of social realism, is that we go much, much deeper into the characters, and we go much, much in a way which is much more lyrical. I move out of reality. I don't just stay in terms of just filming the one thing which is in front. I mean, when I first sat down to write the script, that came very, very naturally. I mean, I started off with the idea of just this single character in a doctor's waiting room. So I normally have a lot of kind of research and a lot of ideas, but when I write, it's very kind of free. I don't necessarily know where the one scene is going to kind of go. So I knew Tim was sat in this doctor's waiting room, so why is he sat there? You begin to kind of build the illness as you go through the film. But after I'd done the first draft, which was maybe like 50 pages, and in that draft, the illness was very kind of realistic and quite kind of straightforward, but the more I worked on the film, the more I felt that the illness could be two things. It could be part of kind of the thriller element, because you have this kind of ticking clock of his illness, but also, you're right, it becomes a manifestation almost of kind of his morality, because the further down that he goes, the worse his kind of body becomes. So it's almost a kind of physical reaction about his consciousness, about telling him that he shouldn't kind of be doing these things. So it's another way of making visual and kind of obvious the interior of the character. The same as when he has the seizure. The seizure is really the moment of kind of a moral breakdown for him. Well, in the original script, we knew a lot more about the mother in terms of why she's in bed and why she's that way, but I kind of removed a lot of it because I didn't think it was necessary. And I thought it was much more interesting for us to just kind of imagine, and the audience to kind of bring their own reasons as to whether it's depression or it's alcoholism or it's any number of things. And it's also because the parents became, in the edit, became more and more like ciphers and more like metaphors. So really, they exist as real characters, but also for me, they exist in this idea of either the old family unit, which I think the mother in a way kind of represents, or the loss of industry, which for me, the father kind of represents. But really about how the mother changes from kind of a real character into something which is kind of positive for him was really stuff that came out of research into kind of the idea of grief, basically. And someone who basically has an unresolved relationship with the parent, and how they have to try and reconfigure that person into a more positive kind of element for them to be able to continue to function. And also it serves like another narrative kind of arc as well, because it's about Tim taking on the idea of responsibility and stop being a child and moving into the idea of being a parent, because at the end he's now responsible for kind of the next generation. And also that comes back to the idea of kind of the responsibility of what we're able to do in order to make, because I think you can see that Tim and Lily under different circumstances would be very, very good responsible parents. It's whether or not they're actually given the ability to have everything around them that a lot of us kind of take for granted that makes them able to kind of function and actually contribute in society.